This past year, our team at Sasaki, a team of planners, urban designers, and data specialists in our strategies group, have been working on what we've been calling Get There. This online tool's overall purpose is to better understand the intersections of mobility and equity in the Boston metropolitan region. It aims to unpack what we understand broadly as mobility access for specific communities who often face heightened challenges in access to employment and everyday needs. Our basic research question asks, how do we understand the dynamics of mobility and access across specific communities in Boston who might be unevenly impacted by existing transportation access, policies, investments, and event-related stresses? Through our work this past summer and fall, we've had to repeatedly ask ourselves the basic research questions of who, what, and where we intend to study and to engage. We felt that we understood the what of mobility access, given the relatively robust amount of ridership and demographic data available, but needed to better focus the questions of where and who so as to provide specific insights that could be generalizable to a broader group. The question of where was most straightforward. We were wisely encouraged to begin with our gateway cities by Dr. Corley and others, as they are known for providing welcoming entry points into regional economies for a wide range of individuals and their skill sets. From there, we studied comparative demographics and existing outreach efforts to select the cities of Malden and Lynn for this greater focus. We hope that these two cities, along with the results from surveys and our analysis, will provide valuable insights and observations that can be applicable to many other gateway cities in the Commonwealth. Here to help us better understand the city of Lynn, we're pleased that Mayor McGee has agreed to join our panel discussion this evening. The question of who is inevitably difficult in any nuanced and intelligent conversation about equity. Working within our sample cities of Malden and Lynn, the team focused on mobility access for environmental justice communities. The United States EPA defines environmental justice communities as minority, low-income, tribal, or indigenous populations or geographic locations in the United States that potentially experience disproportionate environmental harms and risks. This disproportionality can be a result of greater vulnerability to environmental hazards, lack of opportunity for public participation, and other factors. The research that Wendell and Kai will share with you tonight provides a snapshot of our efforts to date, which will wrap up by this year's end. To moderate tonight's panel, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Tracy Corley, Mass Inc.'s Transit-Oriented Development Fellow. At Mass Inc., Dr. Corley brings expertise in economic development, business, labor markets, architecture, law, and public policy. As the Transit-Oriented Development Fellow, she convenes political and community leaders to spur inclusive development in Massachusetts gateway cities. Welcome, Dr. Corley.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, Martin, and welcome everyone to tonight's event. We're here tonight to talk about the uneven access to transit in communities across the Commonwealth. Although roughly 65 municipalities lie proximate to the MBTA's 284 active commuter rail stops, many of the people who live in these communities cannot access the train. In my work to advance compact development and improve transit service to the gateway cities, we see that service, frequency, and cost are the top barriers for local residents. The design of the rail system to shuttle white-collar commuters to jobs in downtown Boston and regional industrial parks still dominates the system strategy, limiting ridership and relevance to communities with lower than average incomes and high proportions of blue-collar service industry and essential workers who rely on transit. Combined housing and transit costs compared to wages and wealth make commuter rail infeasible for many gateway city residents. Meanwhile, inconsistent levels of frequency and service oftentimes make buses impractical for those whose lives and livelihoods don't align with assumptions about how and why people travel. In some communities, as many as 80% of local residents do not work in jobs that they can do from home. And only 15% of the reasons why people travel is for a commute. Designing transit systems to prioritize commuters and 9-to-5 jobs is inequitable on so many levels. Transit that focuses on one class of resident or worker lies at the core of uneven access. but the condition and quality of streets and spaces in the neighborhoods around stations and stops also impact access. How can a resident in a nearby senior housing project access local transit if the sidewalks are broken or covered with ice and snow in the winter? Or how can a person feel safe walking to the bus stop on a dark early spring evening in a neighborhood with a lot of vacant lots, empty buildings, and dim, if any, lighting? Also, how can a parent with a stroller or a shopper with heavy bags safely navigate a station area with a broken elevator and crumbling stairs? Uneven access is real, and the current pandemic means that uneven access to transit and transportation alternatives will grow unless we address these inequities now. So that brings us to our conversation today. I'm excited to introduce our panelists who will present how they're tackling policies and practices that result in uneven access to mobility resources and infrastructure in their work. Our first presentation will be from Mayor Tom McGee, City of Lynn. He's a former state senator for the 3rd Essex District and head of the Transportation Committee, as well as currently is the co-chair of the Commuter Rail Communities Coalition. Mayor McGee and his staff are dedicated to helping the citizens of Lynn in every way possible. While in the legislature, he was chairman of the state for the State Senate Labor and Workforce Development Committee, the Joint Public Service Committee, and the Joint Children's Caucus. Prior to serving in the Senate, he was an attorney who served as state representative from 1995 to 2002. Our second presentation will be by Andreas Sepsuk, a Charles and Ann Spalding Center Development Associate Professor of Urban Science and Planning at MIT, where he also leads the City Forum Lab. Andreas is the author of the Urban Network Analysis Toolbox, used by researchers and practitioners around the world to model pedestrian flows and to study coordinated land use and transportation development. He is currently publishing a book entitled Street Commerce: The Hidden Structure of Retail Location Patterns and Vibrant Sidewalks, and is also leading the Future of Streets Research Initiative, which investigates how cities could adapt their streets and mobility infrastructure in ways that maximize multimodal, socially inclusive, and environmentally sustainable outcomes. Our third presentation will be delivered by Wendell Joseph, Mobility Innovator Project Manager, and Kai Ying Lau, Data and Spatial Analyst at Sasaki. Wendell has a passion and a desire to shape the growth and well-being of our cities and communities by providing practical solutions to complex urban and social issues. Kai utilizes data and spatial analysis and visualization to inform urban planning and policy, as well as to research new tools and methods that better communicate recommendations for decision-making. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mayor McGee.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for asking me to join tonight. It's exciting to have these discussions of importance to my community, but just as importantly for the region. So it's great to be here. And I've got some slides that I think we can go to, and will help me, I think, lay out where Lynn has been and where we want to go. So if we could go to the first slide, and you can see on the first slide here, there's a couple of different representations of what transit connections are to Lynn, and you can see on one of them the blue line. The blue line ends down in Wonderland, down in Revere. Up until the late 1930s, the narrow gauge Lynn, Revere, Boston narrow gauge line ran along what is right now currently the blue line. And from 1946 forward, there's been efforts to bring the blue line rapid transit to Lynn, which has not been successful. So we have the commuter rail connection, and you can see the connections here, and we're working hard to reimagine that with regional rail options, which would bring an electrified, frequent and affordable system into Lynn. It's what we see as the future along what we call as the economic justice corridor coming in from Boston into Lynn on the commuter rail, and that would comes through Everett, Revere, Chelsea, through East Boston and then into Lynn, which is really all of those communities are looking for the kind of access and rapid transit opportunities that would really enhance their ability to grow their economies and create it for everyone and be fair. We go to the next slide, please. Gives a little bit of identification of Lynn and the boundaries of Lynn and some of the density related to the areas surrounding the commuter rail station. And as you can see, the commuter rail heads right through Lynn. There's one station in the city of Lynn right now, which is in the Central Square station, with work being currently going on to create a second station down towards the G, which at the Gearworks location used to be a flag stop for the GE employees. We're working with the future development opportunities to see that as actually a public open stop. So we'd actually have two opportunities for what we envision a regional rail electrified system to create the opportunities for transit in our community we've been missing for decades, if not over half a century. Next slide, please. And as part of the connection through the commuter rail and what it means to us, particularly with the inability to bring rapid transit in the city on Blue Line expansion, as you can see on this slide, there's a number of listed things that we've been working on. Regional rail is something that the Fiscal Management Control Board has embraced. And again, the Fairmont line and the economic justice corridor along this line is really exciting to see that as part of the first phase proposal in the Fiscal Management Control Board's efforts to create regional rail. The Northern Strand is actually the bike trail that originates in Everett and is coming into Lynn with about $11 million being invested this year into next year to finally make the connection into Lynn. It's been talked about for years and years, and that's the first phase. With the second phase, creating that Northern Strand line would come through downtown Lynn, through Market Street, along the Lynn Way with an actually dedicated bike lane all the way to the beach, which would really give both people in our community as well as opportunities for people outside of Lynn to connect to Lynn and to the beach in Lynn along that strand. It's a game changer for us, and it's a really transformational project that is in the process of happening. We're working on reimagining the Lynn Way, and actually I'm very excited today. We were awarded $2.2 million to create an interchange on Blossom Street, which will make it safe and accessible from our waterfront down where the ferry location is, along what will be a broader boardwalk through some development that's happening to the Heritage State Park. A very exciting day today to hear that $2.2 million to create that interchange, but more importantly to start on the way of reimagining the Lynn Way and knitting together both the waterfront and our neighborhoods, which in between has been a 6-lane throughway that has been a real barrier for us to have connections in our community. So that's really an exciting news that we had today. We're working on as well downtown revitalization, which includes a number of other MassWorks projects and Complete Street dollars that we've gotten to have received in the community to create both pedestrian and bike access easily accessible. And we're working on a waterfront master plan, which will create 60 acres of open space. And again, having those connections between the neighborhood and the waterfront will really be another transformative piece of what we see envisioned for all of the citizens and all the residents of the city of Lynn. And transit-oriented development, as I said earlier, is happening at the Gearworks, and that will be another public commuter rail station. That's really exciting to see those options happening. I think there's one other slide, a couple of other slides that will show some of the pictures you can see in this. This is some of the work that we just had done on a MassWorks project with, we actually bumped out the sidewalks, making it an easier access upon past those interchanges for pedestrians. And you can see on the left the bike lanes that we're actually adding separate from the Northern Strand bike trail. But those are dollars we've received through MassDOT. And we've actually been lining our streets with creating bike lanes, but just as importantly, narrowing down the areas that cars are going. They've been great for traffic calming, and again, it's an effort to make the space safe for bikes and pedestrians. I think these two pictures show reflect some of that work's going on, and you can see on the building one of the murals, which is over 50 or 60 murals we have in our downtown area as part of our downtown arts and cultural efforts over the last 2 or 3 years. I think there's one more slide that we could go to. And then you can see another mural on the right as part of that. And then the shared streets with dollars we have received from the state as well, DOT. And you can see the barriers and the painted barriers to allow restaurants to be out in the street, and during this pandemic to have outside dining. And this you can see on the map on the left that identifies all of the bike lanes that we're creating. we're just about completed. One will be a bus and bike lane, the red line. That will be a dedicated bus lane along the Lynn Common, and the rest are bike lanes. And again, we've seen a dramatic shift in traffic safety, and it's really been a calming influence. It's only been about 4 or 5 weeks that we've had these lines and these lanes painted, and we're seeing the results already. So, and all of those really lead, as you can see at the end of going toward the waterfront, that's where the commuter rail station is, and that's where we see all of these investments coming together to ensure that not only do we have future access for affordable and frequent commuter rail service, regional rail service, but the access points throughout the density and the dense area of our downtown and neighborhoods to be able to connect together, and just as importantly, connect to the commuter rail and the regional rail that we see as a really exciting opportunity for our future as well. So with that, I'm happy to go to the next presenter, and we'll happy to be available for questions related to this and other things as we move forward. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mayor. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andreas.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yep. Sorry, trouble with microphones. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me to join this distinguished panel. If we could go to the slides right away. Next, please. I'm also joined by a couple of, or at least one of the co-authors of this project that we did over this last spring and summer, called Transit Access, Improving Walking and Biking to Commuter Rail Stations in Greater Boston. This work was done with both MIT and Harvard graduate students, Ruben Morgan, who's I think with us here today, Sarah Fayyad, who's just graduated and back in Australia, and Dylan Halpern from MIT. Next, please. I teach in the urban planning department at MIT, where I also lead the City Forum Lab, and we have lots of different intersections with this topic we're discussing today. We're very serious about equity, about planning, about social justice when it comes to the built environment, as well as transportation. We have a new institute-wide mobility initiative, and this project has been a real pleasure to work on together with the Sasaki Foundation as well as the Barr Foundation, who's funded the work that would fit into this new initiative. Next, please. So most of you have probably heard about very exciting discussions at the MBTA, especially before the COVID-19 pandemic arrived, about overhauling not just one particular line, but the entire commuter rail system in Greater Boston. The MBTA board and advisory board chose to approve or approve the fifth scenario that was presented. There were 6 different scenarios presented, which would lead to a very substantial improvement to the entire commuter rail network, involving frequency improvements, better platforms, level platforms, different parking solutions, electrification, and major expansion on certain lines. Next, please. This is a long-term project, but in the context of what we looked at over the summer and spring of this year, was an aspect that's not necessarily covered in the plans for the MBTA system-wide upgrade. And that is the access, the pedestrian and bicycle access to each of the stations. And it's a critical component that affects ridership. Next, please. So what we did was system-wide for all 143 commuter rail stations that cover Boston, Greater Boston area, and other cities in Massachusetts, we looked at 3 different ways of delineating access to commuter rail stations. Access is for pedestrians typically delineated as a half-a-mile walkshed, and for bicycles as 1.5-mile walkshed. And so we looked at 3 ways of delineating that. as a circle that some of the previous studies have looked at in delineating a half-mile circle around each station, as a network walkshed which follows the streets, and finally, most importantly, as a perceived travel shed. And the perceived travel shed is not only affected by distance, but the qualities of the streets that lead to the stations. And there was a series of those qualities involved, like you see on the slide here, the presence of ground floor amenities, the dimensions of sidewalk, whether or not you have to walk next to highways, traffic volumes on the roads, etc. Those are factors that we took from previous research and construed a perceived distance metric for every street leading to the station. Next, please. We did the same for bicycles. And as you could imagine, the perceived distance that one feels when biking in cities depends on how good bike infrastructure is. And in this research in particular, we looked at the class rating and even the presence of bike infrastructure, whether there's a lane on the ground, whether there's a dedicated path or a sharrow on the ground that dedicates a bike route, whether or not you have to bike counter traffic to get to destinations, the elevation gain, and so forth. So those are the factors that construe perceived distance metrics. Next, please. That led to a mapping statewide for the commuter rail network. And you can actually access this URL, boston.transitaccess.com, on your own computers and zoom into any station area and look at the sizes of these three different areas for both walk and bike access. And within those catchment areas at all three levels, for the circle, for the network, and for the perceived walksheds, we calculate how many jobs, how many residents, how much vacant land, how many amenities are actually available at the different delineations that we choose. And we also did some scenarios in these maps that would show how, for instance, an investment into better bike infrastructure, like Mayor McGee just showed, would transform those perceived bike sheds and make them feel larger. Next, please. So very quickly, a couple of takeaways. We find that these delineations can be quite consequential, especially when it comes to TOD-related policymaking. If we actually look at the perceived walksheds and the perceived bike sheds for half a mile and 1.5 mile respectively, we find that on average, they only contain about a third of the jobs and the residents that are generally marked or mapped into the circular areas. So the circular areas can grossly overestimate how many people would benefit from rail access or improvements that are in the pipeline, or how much TOD development space is potentially available. Next, please. We find system-wide that there's roughly 8 million square feet of vacant parcels within the perceived half a mile walksheds, and roughly 31 million square feet of vacant parcels within the 1.5 miles of bike sheds around the systems in the perceived definition, which is what we think is the most accurate way of describing the true TOD zones around the stations. And this is considerably less than typically assumed with the simpler and generally bigger delineations of access sheds. We also find that not all places are lucky to have any existing bike infrastructure in place. In fact, system-wide, only about 2% of all streets that are within those perceived 1.5 mile bike sheds actually contain any kind of bike marking or dedicated bike infrastructure. So 98% do not. Next, please. And so I'll conclude or finish with some of the work that we're now doing as next steps, or something that's coming up as potential research. So how we delineated perceived distances and perceived walksheds and bike sheds in this research was based on a large amount of pedestrian and bike trajectories mapped from GPS apps. Those were collected in San Francisco. And they don't allow us to actually break the analysis down by different age groups, gender groups, race groups. And that would be something that we look to do in the future, to have a different sense of perception of distance for these different groups. Second, it'd be great to complement this analysis with more interview data on the ground to understand what other factors may in fact impact people's perception of walking and biking distances. And third, to look at how those qualities of streets not only change perception of distance, but may actually materialize in ridership data. are people, all else equal, are people less likely to ride and walk to stations if street conditions are poor? And that's something we're now looking to do as follow-up research. And two of the key recommendations that the report puts out is that we think it would be tremendously beneficial if these MBTA upgrades, once they materialize for the commuter rail system, would spend a portion of those investments in actually improving access to the station. We think that's one of the key ways that ridership can actually be increased or improved. And second, that TOD development projects, whether through zoning or private sector involvement, would be prioritized within those perceived half-a-mile walk sheds where people are most likely to actually choose to walk to the stations, and not in the sort of overestimated broader areas outside where a new development might be built but not necessarily generate walking trips to the station. With that, thank you, and we can move to the next.
Great, thank you so much, Andreas. Now I'm going to turn it over to Wendell and Kai.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here this evening and talk about our work looking at mobility equity. Kai and I will be tag teaming this presentation, but we'll just introduce ourselves briefly. Again, I'm Wendell Joseph, project manager for Get There project.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kai Lau with Sasaki Strategies. I'll be helping out with the data analysis for this project.
Next slide, please. So just the project overview is that what we're working on is a story map that spatially explores mobility access challenges in gateway cities and opportunities for equitable investment. Before going further, I would say that the impetus for this project really, or the goal, is to support local efforts that are already happening that are looking to address mobility equity. We acknowledge that this is work that is ongoing, that has been going on for a while, and that continues. And so what we really want to do is support this effort by helping to tell that story through visualization tools, which can be a powerful asset in kind of like really getting the ball rolling on how we not only assess and value, but also invest in our community so that people can move freely, safely, and comfortably. Next slide, please. And so, we've already touched on gateway cities. There's not much more I can say about gateway cities that Dr. Corley hasn't already mentioned. But what I would like to add a little bit more on is this, environmental justice community, or EJCs. And so where Martin at the beginning of the program had talked a little bit about EJCs, and I think where equity is a concern, I think it's important that we focus on people and communities that have been disproportionately harmed and disrupted by their surrounding environment. What I want to stress is that people in communities that have been designated as EJCs are not necessarily at risk or more susceptible to harm purely based on demographic factors or socioeconomic statuses, but rather it's the environment that surrounds them. And this includes, yes, the natural environment, but also the built environment, and the policies and laws and practices that have created those environments that cause harm. Innovation is everywhere. People are resilient. People are creative and capable. And I think it's important to assess the environment and how it has been designed and built, and think about ways to respond to this reality that people are resilient and capable, and that environments that surround them need to be invested, as well as the people, in ways that can make communities a bit more whole. And so there are two main components of this project. I'll talk about the interactive survey in a bit, but I did want to tee up the online story map that is going to be released in about a month. And so the online story map is kind of like a New York Times style approach to data visualization, data analysis in a narrative form. And the reason that we took this approach is to, is basically lower the barrier to participation and interaction, and allow that our work here is accessible to the general public, to local activists and advocates, and to public officials as well. And, we'll show a little bit of what that could look like in a bit. Next slide, please. As far as the interactive survey, this was an opportunity for us to learn more about how people experience mobility on a regular basis, and how that experience changes spatially from one part of a city or one neighborhood in a city to another. And so there are two different components to the interactive survey. One was a mapping portion, and one is kind of like more of a prioritizer. So the mapping part basically allows folks to drop markers down in different parts of the city and also of the region, really, to indicate where they go on a regular basis, be that work or school or, a restaurant, and how they get there, and any of the challenges that they face along the way. The prioritizing part then allows folks to indicate what matters most in terms of priorities relative to how they get from point A to point B. It's not an exhaustive list. There's, obviously room for folks to add a little bit more, but we wanted to try to just capture a little bit of what goes into going from point A to point B, and what the challenges are, but also opportunities. The key for this survey was to start to spatialize some of the challenges, needs, and priorities, and also opportunities for investment. And so through that spatialization process, we can get a sense not only of what patterns or trends are emerging, but again, where they are emerging. And so, for example, if a lot of the challenges that we see relative to biking or walking are happening in areas that have been designated as environmental justice communities, then there's something going on there that requires a closer look, so that we can better address it. So I'll hand it off to Kai to talk a little bit more about our data approaches with this work. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Wendell. So since this project is still ongoing, we will be sharing a bit about how we're thinking through our research questions, what data we'll be looking at, and how we're incorporating the results from the interactive survey that Wendell just showed. So to approach our first research question, what and where are the opportunities to improve mobility choices? We are looking at who is living within Lynn or Malden, where do those people live, or where do those people living in EJCs travel to, and how does that compare to other residents, and how do they get there? So we're pulling from common data sets like the ACS, employment data from the LEHD Origin Destination Statistics, and the MBTA, but we'll also be folding in mapped results from the Get There survey, which we hope will bring a more nuanced and human element to the story we end up telling. And building off of that, the Get There results will really give us an idea of what matters most to people and how their journey can improve. This could include spatializing people's priorities and again, looking at that through the lens of EJCs. And lastly, takeaways from the previous two questions will hopefully provide guidance to planners, practitioners, or local advocates who are asking this question of how can investments in mobility align with the expressed needs and desires of these communities. Next slide, please. So to provide an example, here are some initial results from the survey. The survey is still open until the end of the month, so this is just representing the data that we've gotten so far. So the dots here are showing locations where respondents have faced challenges while walking. And we further processed this data so that we can identify which dots were placed by respondents living in EJCs. And even though we know that the responses are limited in terms of numbers and are not representative of the community, the clusters of challenges from people living in EJCs that we're seeing here still suggest that there might be something in that area that warrants further investigation. It brings up more questions on whether there's something there, maybe sidewall conditions is a barrier that needs to be studied more. So spatializing community engagement results in this way, along with people's priorities, which we will be getting into once our survey is closed, will really help guide our understanding of how access to mobility choices is experienced and perceived on the ground. Next slide, please. So if you live in Lynn and Malden or know of anyone that would like to or should be participating, we encourage you to take the survey. I believe Marianne sent the link in the chat. So if you want to be updated when the final website is released, feel free to reach out to Wendell and we'll also add you to our email list. And finally, you can also stay updated through Sasaki Foundation and Sasaki social media channels. With that, we look forward to sharing a bit more in our discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kai. Well, with that, I think it's time for us to kind of get our discussion started. Once again, thank you to all of our presenters today. I would like to kind of kick off the conversation by just kind of talking about something that's very real and very front and center today. I know, I think Mayor McGee, you and I have been in a number of conversations today around this particular topic about the cuts that the MBTA has announced across the region to make up for the projected nearly $500 million in budget deficit that they're expecting. For example, for those who are on the call who haven't heard, All of the ferry services are expected to be cut completely, while the commuter rail is going to end services early during the weekdays and not run on the weekends. And then the buses would also stop running early. Mayor McGee, kind of what are your thoughts on these changes, and how could these changes actually impact Lynn and the people who live there? And also, if you have an opportunity, just kind of talk a little bit more about kind of what some of the alternatives are that you kind of see that might be possible.
Well, thanks for the question. And we were actually on another call earlier today talking about the same challenges with the Commuter Rail Coalition. Obviously, as we're talking about equity and mobility and access, and how important regional rail, commuter rail, and those access points are, as well as buses and the whole MBTA system. It really is a challenge to see that the cuts are there, and there's $500 million that they need to find to continue to run the service. It's something, as we face this pandemic and this challenge together, that we need to understand how important. It's really the lifeblood of today, but more importantly for our future, to create a ongoing, vibrant transit system. And the key piece that we need to take a look at is how do we get through this challenge, make sure that if there are cuts made, they're limited, and that those cuts, none of those cuts are permanent. And it's a discussion we've had even before the pandemic. How do we adequately fund our transit system to make sure that it's a system that works for everyone? And so we need to have those broader discussions. Where do we get the revenue? How do we create a fair way to get that revenue? And how do we make the investments that will create a robust system? And I think just as importantly, the access points, whether it be a mile, a mile and a half, or as we heard during these discussions, so that you can actually access what is such an important piece of our future. We're looking at housing challenges and transit-oriented development, 250,000 housing units that we need to build in the region. There's no way that we're going to be able to reach that goal and create the kind of opportunity without a substantial investment in transit and a robust transit system. And so we need to work together to face that challenge together, find a way to fund the MBTA for today. But as we heard on the call earlier today that I was on, it's not just about finding the operating costs for today, but how do we get the capital investment and the dollars to run a much more robust and broader system for today and tomorrow. So it's a challenge we need to step up and face together. It's the future of our economy. It's the future of our region, and it really is a challenge that we have to work to find a way to get the resources to make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about unequal access and equity, where we spend our dollars, how we invest in community shows where our priorities are, shows where our values are. And if we really do want and value people, we need to start making investments in communities, and also make sure we're making investments in those systems, infrastructure, resources that are going to help people improve their lives and livelihoods.
Just one quick point, I think, is the the public investment leads to so much private investment. I think that's the missed point that we don't talk about, that those investments that we see, the private dollars, double and triple the dollars that we spend on the public side to create jobs and housing and the economy we need. So I think we need to really highlight the importance of that and what it means to make those public investments.
Thanks for pointing it out. That is just so critical. I do want to kind of turn back to the topic of commuter rail and look to you, Andreas, to kind of talk about your research, which is focused on the experience and ease of how people get through commuter rail stations, not just in Lynn, but throughout the entire system. Your transit access, improving walking and biking, commuter rail stations in Greater Boston, makes a distinction between network distances and perceived distances. Can you talk a little bit more about perceived distances and how that can mean different things to different people? So, for example, how does the study take into account the differences between the TOD areas, the difference in the quality of the sidewalks and the conditions there? And what should policymakers know about equity concerns when using the transit access tool?
Yes, so this notion of perceived distance is based on a quantitative analysis of people's walking trajectories from cell phone data. And the way it's done is it's called pedestrian path choice analysis, which generally looks at how people walked, and then we construct a few alternatives that seem very plausible ways that people could have walked roughly similar distance, and then the statistical analysis is able to distinguish what was it exactly about the route people chose that had these attributes that they perceived as positive. Why did they choose this route over that? The results of this kind of analysis can be turned into equivalence of distance. So we can kind of actually say that having a sidewalk that's 10 feet wider is equivalent to feeling as if the walk is 50 yards shorter. Or having an extra ground floor amenity that you pass by makes the walk feel, let's say, 10 feet shorter per business. So if you have 100 of them, that could be 1,000 feet, et cetera. And so those are the kinds of, so there's a whole list of attributes that is included for walk and bike perception. And those are delineated actually from a large population of tens of thousands of trajectories. And so they don't, as I mentioned, distinguish individually how different age groups or gender groups could feel those perceptions to differ. But I would highlight that since they do delineate a kind of population average perception, I think it still accurately describes at least we could expect that for the more vulnerable groups, those perception areas might be even smaller, but at least focusing on these perceived areas that apply to the population as a whole is a big step forward from just looking at it as a circle or as a network walkshed. And I think it's important for the old, the young, the differently abled, or people carrying packages, et cetera, to really focus on these areas where one feels like it's a 10-minute walk, because otherwise we're, it might even feel like a 30-minute walk. And in the study, we do highlight some strategies that towns could use to expand these perception areas outward. And they're all sort of dependent on these individual attributes of streets that go into the estimates of perceived distance. But for instance, we looked at, for biking, two scenarios that seemed consequential. Scenario one was to implement a bike lane. And so there's a separated bike lane painted on the ground within a half a mile from the stations in all streets, and a bike sharrow or route on the pavement that just puts a sign on the pavement within the remaining mile donut around those station areas, and looked at how much that intervention could actually system-wide increase the sizes of perceived 10-minute bike shares. And similarly, one of the consequential things for bicyclists, which feels very negative in practice, is biking in the opposite direction. The counter to traffic, that is. So if opposite direction to traffic. And people generally, according to the coefficients we used, feel that kind of bicycling feels like 4 times longer than biking in a normal direction, all else equal. So that's a very consequential thing. And some of the cities in the state have been implementing these interventions on the pavement that put paint on the ground and signs on the street that you can actually bike 2 ways on one-way streets. And that could go a long way in sort of reducing the stress level. Of course, it's better if it's also safe and segregated bike lanes, et cetera. But those 2 interventions were 2 potential low-cost scenarios we examined to enable the cities to improve these bike sheds outward. And the similar scenarios were presented for walk sheds.
Yeah, well, that's great, because it's great that there are some tools in there to kind of help kind of think through like different ways to kind of apply the tool to local conditions. Of course, demographics, of course, always matter. I think about like in Fitchburg, a lot of the people who live around that commuter rail station are actually in senior housing. And so, which is going to make a huge difference. But then again, of course, our gateway cities, as well as all of our communities, are always changing. You always have people moving in and out. And so making sure that your community is flexible, you don't put something in that's going to cost millions upon millions of dollars to change in the future, is a really key thing to keep in mind. And so let's kind of move forward, I think, to a third scenario. And I'm going to turn it over to Kai and Wendell to respond to this. I have 2 questions for you guys. And so understanding communities, which is something we've touched on quite a bit in this conversation, is key to improving mobility and equity for local communities. Your study is actually providing really key insights into how people move around the region, what travel they deem to be useful, and where investments and focused attention is needed in order to improve equity and access. And so really appreciate this study because it's one that it requires in community engagement. before we talk a little bit more in depth about community engagement, I'd like to ask Kai a little bit about the quality of the data and the role that that plays in community engagement process and investigating issues related to equity. Kai, how do you think we can look at data in the process of collecting, analyzing, visualizing the data through the lens of equity? And what are some examples in this project that you can draw from?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Corley. As I've been reading up more on data equity, one thing that I've been learning and keeping in mind is recognizing that bias in data exists along all stages of a project, from data collection, analysis, interpretation, to communication. So how can we in our work, looking at mobility through the lens of equity, keep that in mind? Even if we recognize that the data and what comes from the analysis can't be 100% objective, because it's collected by people, analyzed by people, shaped by people, we can still prioritize equity at every step of the process, and most importantly, be transparent about the limitations. So for example, for the Get There project that we're working on, we're looking at who lives in Lynn and Malden through the ACS data, and also drawing interpretations from our survey results. But one thing we had to make a decision on is whether we should use ACS data at the census tract level or the block group level. And at the city scale, census tracts don't really get us to the specificity that we'd like to see spatially. But the margin of errors are smaller, so at that scale, the estimates are more accurate than if we were to use the data at the block group level. Yet at the block group level, that is really the scale that will show more nuance spatially within the city as we look at the data. So in the end, we decided we'll use block group level ACS data, but in our interpretation, we're making sure that, we're really just drawing trends from it rather than making statements that hint at statistical significance. Not only that, but we intend to make those decisions and concerns about the limitations of the data transparent on our final story map website. So the point is that, your goals kind of influence how you use data and how you see data. And I think especially when it comes to storytelling, sometimes what the public is seeing are kind of interpretations. That's kind of the key takeaways. They're not really looking at seeing the raw hard results. And as we are wrapping up this project, we're trying to understand the basis for our interpretations. So for example, if we're seeing that certain block groups are less cost burdened in terms of the percent of income they're spending on housing and transportation, which raises more questions of why. Like, is the commuter rail too expensive that it's not even an option for them? And if they did take the commuter rail, how would that change the cost burden metric? And that last question will be hard to answer with the data available, but it's okay if a project raises more questions, because then those questions can serve as a basis for future research. And given that the survey responses we have gotten so far are not representative of the city, being transparent about that fact, but still drawing intentional interpretations or questions for further research is still valuable as we continue working on mobility equity.
Thank you for that. And I really appreciate that you mentioned, Kai, that the results that you've been getting so far haven't been representative necessarily of the city of Lynn. And so I'm going to turn over to Wendell to ask, like maybe to comment a little further on what Kai was talking about, but also how do you get community engagement during a global pandemic? And so how have you guys been kind of handling this? And what does this mean for the study overall?
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. In community engagement is always challenging work. It's really kind of like, roll up your sleeves and get into it kind of work, even under the best of conditions, right? Because we're talking about being able to try to bring folks around a topic to have meaningful discussions and try to figure out a path forward that try to really uplifts and benefits community. So it is tough work. So COVID just kind of like really throws a monkey wrench into all of that, because one of the best ways to do community engagement, which is in person, like face to face, we don't have the luxury of anymore. One of the big components of this project was to have a series of workshops over the summer in the incubator space in our offices in Watertown. We would invite the community in, and for like a half day or a day, kind of like get into the weeds of this project. And it would have been an ideal situation to, peel back the layers and get closer to the core of the issues and try to like uncover what the nuances are in experiences and how they range across communities. And then we couldn't do that anymore, right? So like a lot of other folks and a lot of projects, we had to resort to purely digital and virtual engagement, which again is challenging because not only are we not only are you talking about the how people access how people are able to access the internet and their comfortability with digital mediums, but I think what COVID and everything else going on this year has shown incredibly clear, which that doesn't mean it wasn't the case before, but it's just like crystal clear now, is that even the capacity to engage is a question that you have to consider during the engagement process. Case in point, when we started, we wanted to focus on Lynn, but also the city of Lawrence, right? And during the initial outreach process, we reached out to Lynn, things are going great. When we started talking to folks in Lawrence, what we started hearing from the people that we spoke to was, this is a great project. We're excited about this. We're looking forward to it. We can see how it'll be useful to our community. This is not a good time. And part of that did have to do with COVID and just everything else going on, but it also had to do with folks there who've been doing this work, the digital divide, that for whatever reason, even before COVID, digital engagement is just a challenge in Lawrence, and they just have so much more success in doing in-person engagement. And so again, they were excited about the project. They could see its use and how it could be of help to what they're trying to do. Also not a good time. And so we had to be responsive to that and kind of like pivot. And that's when we chose to do Malden. Thankfully, we have been making some progress there. And so, it's just that's the nature of engagement, right? I mean, it is dynamic, it is ever changing. And I think we have to be responsive and responsible as a result of what happens. So, it's been tough.
Yeah.
And as Kai mentioned, the surveys have been going well, but it's not necessarily representative of, it's not as robust and as representative as we want it to be. But, again, it's useful and it can point to things that require closer examination. So that's still useful to us and to our project. And we're also planning on continuing this work in some other ways moving forward. So, Andreas earlier had mentioned MIT's Mobility Initiative, and we've been talking to them to be part of their Mobility Summit and Symposium next year as a way to continue this conversation, to talk about our work, but to also try to tap into the community engagement component, hopefully at a time where we can do that in a more meaningful way. And so even though things haven't gone exactly as planned this time around, I think we're still holding on to it and looking forward to how we can do it in the near future.
That's very interesting to hear. And just so our audience knows, we have done some research around the digital divide at Mass Inc. And we found that some of our communities have up to 40% of households don't have access to a computer in their homes. I know that some of us kind of take, computer access and interactivity for granted. But if you don't have a computer in your home, if you don't have broadband internet access, sometimes kind of participating in some of this research can be a challenge. And so I was actually having a conversation earlier this week where I heard from people who have been working to do similar things during the pandemic. And one thing to keep in mind is that, organizing is still kind of on the ground, knocking on doors, even though at a social distance, is still a way that we have to be kind of thinking about making sure that we're being inclusive and getting feedback from people who live in our communities. But I want to kind of come back to Mayor McGee and ask a little bit more about kind of just based upon these tools and what you've been hearing so far, kind of what are some of the ways you kind of see maybe Lynn kind of implementing some of these tools and some of the outcomes from these tools in order to kind of help some of your decision-making process? And you're on mute, Mayor.
Thank you. I mean, the key is being able to get the engagement and the feedback from the community to understand. Looking at one of the charts with the numbers, the dots all over areas where should be a much more good feeling about walking around the community, and realizing that there's definitely feelings of unease or that isn't an area you want to walk around. So I think using those tools and really getting a chance to get feedback from the community to understand what they're thinking, and then as we really make some investments to try and expand an easier, more safe feeling for walking around. I mean, that's the goal for us, the walkability in our downtown and throughout the community, as well as the bike access. Are people feeling the changes? What else do they think is important for us to do to allow them to really move freely around the community? I lived in Lynn all my life, and but I guess being in City Hall every day and realizing how close everything is in our community, and we're much more walkable, I think, than we give ourselves credit for. But if you talked about someone walking from City Hall up to Market Basket, it seems like, wow, that's a long way. Or walking up to the Stop and Shop, and everything was probably within a half mile to a mile. But I think for people, it really feels like it's much longer. So I think getting an understanding of why that is and what people are thinking, these tools really are helpful for us to get a better read on what are we doing right and what can we do better.
Excellent. Well, I'm getting a little bit of an echo, but I know that Lynn has been doing some really great work. I think it wasn't too long ago that there was a lighting project that was put in around the commuter rail station. And there, of course, is a lot of development that's happening there. But, as, our communities grow and develop, that then also changes our ability to kind of get access to accurate information as to kind of what's happening, in our communities. And so I want to ask kind of two questions. I would love for someone, maybe Wendell or Andreas or Kai, to kind of talk a little bit about kind of ACS, which is a product of the Census Bureau, and the kind of like what some of the opportunities and challenges are there with the census, as we've just gone through a census process. Just going to want to talk about that a little bit, but also kind of what opportunities and challenges are kind of posed as we're trying to leverage these tools and make decisions based on them. What kind of opportunities and challenges exist when development starts happening again, which we hope is either happening now or starts happening very soon. What happens to kind of like the usefulness of the tools that you've created for helping policymakers make decisions? And don't everybody jump in at once.
I'll try to take a stab at it. So I'd like to address the second question in terms of like what happens now as we think in the future. I think ACS is useful in helping to project and keep track of trends, demographic trends and whatnot. I think what is particularly challenging is that I feel, because of the acute shock that the pandemic is, I think I'd be very interested in seeing how much things change. I mean, let's take employment, for example, right? I mean, we hit record numbers of employment before the summer even was done. And so, I mean, think about how that throws, these 5-year estimates, 3-year estimates, think about how much that changes things. So the data is helpful in establishing some sort of a baseline or making some educated or scientific guesses. But when something as drastic as a global pandemic happens, and it just really, again, throws a curveball to data, how we respond and how we refine our approach is important. I think that's part of where on the ground community organizing work is important, to try to cover maybe not cover the difference, but to at least try to remain as relevant as possible. I mean, I think in terms of thinking about how we make decisions for now and for the future, relevance is important. And that's part of the reason why data is not, it's only one part of the equation. And I feel like if we are in a point where data itself is just, and I mean, that's not even just talking about the fact that this year's census is also a huge question mark. So, I think whereas once upon a time we could have relied on census data to try to do some good data-based work with this, I mean, this year's, politically and logistically, it's just, who knows, right? So I think perhaps now more than ever, we're gonna have to rely on just on the ground work to at least locally keep track of what's happening in our communities.
And it sounds like that would make some of your community-based organizations kind of important partners in making sure that you have accurate information kind of moving forward about kind of what's happening on the ground. That's community organizations, faith-based organizations, people who live in our communities. Andreas or Kai, either one of you want to kind of weigh in on kind of what's going on right now and with the usefulness moving forward?
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with what Wendell said, especially since if we're kind of studying a smaller scale like a city, it's really hard to use ACS, to only rely on ACS for that kind of like demographic data. Just as I mentioned, like margin of errors for the smaller scales is just not great. So definitely community organizations and on the ground surveys that might also include some kind of spatial aspect would really help in currently and in the future, just better understanding our communities.
Yeah, I would particularly chime in on, I guess, both questions on the ACS as well as challenges ahead. On the one interesting area where ACS data is used, which maybe not everybody knows, is in identifying modal splits in cities. Modal split describes what % of people travel to work on what mode, whether they drive or bike or take transit, etc. And the kinds of projects that Mayor McGee showed in the beginning, where there's either MassDOT or federally supported infrastructure improvement projects for biking and walking, typically require some type of impact analysis that you need to show to the funder how much impact you expect the project to produce. Most consultants do that sort of analysis based on very questionable ACS data, and because in America, people drive so much that the modal split estimates for walking and biking are oftentimes not even statistically significant. So that the modal split estimates that ACS data shows for cities are, we can't even say that they are not zero, because their sample is so small, because ACS is based on a very small questionnaire. It's not the census, right? It's only a sample. So it's a big challenge to actually understand the demand for active mobility because the data is not there, and the ACS is a really poor source for that sort of data. And so I think we need to think big in terms of how could cities systemically and continuously gather better information to really understand their community's needs and potential for active travel and public transit travel. So all the green modes, not necessarily only driving. And I think there's really great opportunities ahead for that too. In transportation, the key way in which, for instance, developments are oftentimes, the development impacts are studied is called transportation impact assessments, or TIAs, that most developers have to go by if it's a development big enough. But TIAs too are almost entirely focused on vehicles. So we have opportunities to think of how could we do TIAs for pedestrians and TIAs for bicyclists, so that any new development coming to town would have to show how it's going to impact walkers and bikers and other vulnerable street users who are not necessarily in the car. And I think there's tremendous opportunity there. And one last thing I'll say about this, we've done a separate study over the summer on COVID mobility. So we worked with SafeGraph data and understood particularly in the Somerville, Cambridge, and the core Boston area, how people's movement and behavior has changed under COVID, how their mobility behavior, particularly the day-to-day trips that still did take place to amenity clusters, not to their offices, but their sort of neighborhood-based trips, which are actually the majority of trips in any normal year as well. As Dr. Corley mentioned, work trips are only about 20% of all trips in the US, right? So one of the troubling findings we have found is that people have started traveling further in their neighborhood and local trips. This probably reflects that they're driving more, which makes a perfect sense. Under COVID, people are more careful. It's a public health hazard. And also their just schedules may be more flexible because they're at home. They're not constrained by a very tight meeting schedule. So maybe they have more choice on when to travel and how far to travel, so distances are going up. But this is flatly against what many cities have been trying to achieve. I mean, there's been a concerted effort to facilitate local and short-range travel, and all these active mobility projects essentially try to encourage moving to closer destinations on foot and by bike. And we, as a result of COVID, we're seeing trips actually moving further. And that's going to be something we're going to have to deal with in the years ahead. And we don't know whether that behavior will shift away once COVID is over, or whether we're going to see some lag effects that result in several years of undoing some of the progress that good transportation planning and progressive transportation planning was able to achieve before COVID.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Andres. And I want to just kind of reiterate that the evidence does not support some of the myths that are out there about transit being super spreaders of COVID-19. As a matter of fact, it's the complete opposite. They found very few, if any, direct connections to public transit and COVID-19. I just want to kind of remind our audience about that. But I realize we're also like right at time, and I'm wondering, do we have like maybe just one more minute for one last question? Because we have someone from St. Louis who has a great question that would be perfect for Mayor McGee to kind of close us out on. So I'm going to ask this question, and I know that here in Massachusetts, as someone who's kind of lived in different jurisdictions, that oftentimes, planning happens like at the county level or at a coordinated regional level. But in Massachusetts, we have 351 municipalities and no unincorporated areas, which makes kind of a challenge for planning. And when we think about transportation and mobility. And so Larissa from St. Louis was wondering, if maybe you can kind of talk about how you're addressing mobility at the borders. What happens when you start thinking about transit systems that start crossing those borders and, going beyond, maybe regional rail to get or commuter rail to kind of think maybe also about sidewalks and bicycle infrastructure. Are there any kind of innovations that are kind of happening around that, Mayor McGee?
I think that's a great question. We do plan locally, but as you work on this, and I've worked on it over the years, you realize that locally is so connected to beyond local, even though we're so connected to our communities, cities, or towns. So it is. I think there has been efforts, and I've been involved in those, and many people have, about how do we think beyond our borders, beyond our communities, and create kind of a regional perspective, which then can lend itself to even beyond the state of Massachusetts. I think the interesting thing on the regional rail, maybe this, I don't know if I'm going beyond the question, is the model is Toronto in some respects. And if you place the Greater Toronto area onto Massachusetts, you'd encompass northern Rhode Island and southern New Hampshire. So the reality of where we are closer than we think, and so our common interests are much that are there. Sometimes it's hard to find those common interests when you're thinking so in a parochial way or locally. But as I've been involved in transportation, I've become much more aware. If I really want to see some exciting things happening in Lynn, yes, we have to do the local pieces that bring people to the commuter rail station. But the reality is, if we really want to see the connections that make sense, that are not work related, but really bring us together, it does transcend our communities, and building those regional coalitions and those regional discussions, similar to the discussion we're having tonight, although it's Malden and Lynn. The reality is, the communities that surround us, that's from Malden and Lynn, are just as connected to these kind of issues. I think sometimes it's a barrier because we're so focused on our local, but I think we really are trying to break those barriers down and work together to ensure that the investment we make and the decisions we make are something that we can see communities share together and share those solutions together. And the dollars that we need to make it happen really need to be collaborative.
Excellent. I hope the teams that we see here tonight kind of help to facilitate some more collaboration and kind of more regional thinking about our transportation and mobility solutions. And with that, I'm going to close this out and say thank you very much to all of our panelists for being here this evening. Thank you for your presentations. Thank you for the conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to Marianne Ocampo to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Corley. I just want to say on behalf of the foundation, we're very happy, and it was so exciting to hear from all the folks that were panelists, Mayor McGee, Andres, Kai, and Wendell. Dr. Corley, thank you so much for being here. This work will continue into the next year. We're going to be wrapping some things up with the Mobility Innovator initiative, but we will continue to some degree with some symposia that we will connect with you all on for next year. Thank you again for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in 2021.